Hello there, neighbors. Just a quick mention before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short-form content on TikTok and Instagram. So if you would be so kind, stop on over to either of those platforms and check it out. It's in the same vein as the things that I talk about on the podcast. Once in a while, there's some content there that's a little bit more lighthearted and comedic than the podcast itself, but I think you'll enjoy it. And if you do, please like, follow, and comment if you would. Alrighty then, let's move on to the episode. So I don't know if you caught this one in the news in the last day or so, but a 24-year-old who pleaded guilty for his role in January 6th now has a job at the Pentagon. And, it's not a campaign job. It's not like an internship or some, conservative youth conference position. It's a job in the Pentagon, a real job. According to reporting from the Associated Press, Elias Irizarry pleaded guilty to misdemeanor trespassing and served 14 days in jail and was later placed in a Pentagon policy office connected to national security and military strategy. The Pentagon has defended him as qualified, patriotic young professional. And look, I believe in second chances. I believe people can make mistakes, be held accountable, grow up, and move forward with their lives. But there is a difference between a second chance and a sensitive national security role at the Department of Defense. And that difference shouldn't require a lot of explanation or a flow chart. This is not just about one appointment. It's about what that appointment represents, what it's the latest example of. Because in Trump 2.0, this just keeps happening. People are being placed in major roles, not because they are the most experienced, not because they have the strongest subject matter background, not because they have spent years preparing to lead complicated agencies, but because they check a very different box, or different boxes: loyalty, celebrity, ideological usefulness, television presence, personal devotion to Trump, a willingness to treat institutions like enemies and expertise like, a rash. That is the new credential, the loyalty resume. And once that becomes the document that matters most, everything else just starts to wobble. Health policy gets handed to people hostile to public health consensus. Education gets handed to people with little education background and a political interest in shrinking the department. Defense gets handed to a television warrior and a culture war salesman. Intelligence gets handed to someone with no obvious intelligence background. Federal law enforcement gets handed to people whose public identity is pretty much wrapped around Trump's grievance machine. And government itself gets handed to a billionaire who treated the federal bureaucracy like a junk drawer with classified attachments. So today we're talking about underqualification. But not just in the narrow sense of this person lacks a credential. That would be too simple. Some of these people have real credentials. Some have partial experience. Some can be described as smart. Some have experience running things. Some have worked in government. Some have relevant pieces of background. The problem is mismatch. The problem is when the wrong qualification is treated like the right one. The problem is when loyalty outranks expertise by leaps and bounds. Because when that happens, you're not staffing the government anymore. You're just building a court. And in a republic, that should scare the hell out of anyone. Greetings, neighbors. Happy Friday, and welcome to another edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left, the podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, as always, your opinionated host, and today we're going to be talking about qualifications, specifically qualifications as they relate to this current Trump administration. And I know I'm certainly not the first one to bring up the concept of what this administration looks like in terms of the talent that it's put into place. And it's not even the first time I've spoken about it. But this recent appointment of the 24-year-old with zero terrorism or counterterrorism experience into a position in the Pentagon has brought the subject back into the conversation, and is just another example of this ongoing pattern that we have seen so painfully evident in Trump 2.0. Now, before we get into the examples, I like to be fair as I can be. Presidents are allowed to appoint people who share their worldview. No one expects a president to pick, people from the opposite party or people who, will contradict them on the basic premises of their platform and their plans. So picking people who are like-minded is totally normal. Democrats appoint Democrats, Republicans appoint Republicans. Presidents choose people who support their agenda. Nobody expects a cabinet secretary to be lowered from the ceiling in a glowing orb of nonpartisan perfection. But there's supposed to be a floor. There's supposed to be some relationship between the job and the person chosen to do it. If you're going to run health and human services, you should have some serious relationship to public health policy, medical systems, science, insurance programs, hospital administration, or large-scale health management. If you're going to run education, you should have serious experience with schools and students, teachers, universities, civil rights and education, special education, student aid, or education policy in general. If you're going to run defense, military service matters, but it's not the whole job. The Pentagon is not just troops and flags. It's one of the largest institutions on earth, with global military operations, procurement, alliances, classified information, nuclear policy, and, multiple decisions that can put lives at risk. If you're going to lead the FBI, the question is not whether you dislike the same people that Trump dislikes. The question is supposed to be whether you can protect federal law enforcement from becoming the president's private revenge department. And if you're going to be touching federal systems through something like DOGE, the question shouldn't be whether you are rich or disruptive or good at firing people. The question is supposed to be whether you understand that government is not a company, citizens aren't customers, and rights are not inefficiencies. That's supposed to be the basic standard. Not perfection, not sainthood, not, a PhD in every subcommittee, but relevant experience, sound judgment, respect for the mission, and enough humility to know what you don't know. And that last part matters a lot, because one of the most dangerous kinds of underqualification isn't necessarily ignorance. It's confidence without competence. It's the person who walks into, a very complicated agency convinced that all of the experts are idiots. The rules are all obstacles. The institutions can be fixed with neat slogans and firings and a few appearances on cable news. That is not reform. That's just a leaf blower. And the stakes are real, of course. At HHS, bad leadership affects vaccines, disease response, Medicare, Medicaid, food safety, drug approval, and just, overall trust from the public. At education, it affects students with disabilities, poor school districts, civil rights enforcement, student loans, and the protection of vulnerable kids. At defense, to say the least, it puts the troops and missions at risk. At the FBI, it can turn law enforcement into, political retaliation. At intelligence agencies, it can distort what the president and Congress understand about foreign threats. So this is not, some inside Washington personnel complaint. This is not about who gets a nice office and, a nice title. This is about whether government is being staffed to serve the public or perhaps only to serve one man. This pattern that we all see, it's important. It's not one strange hire. It's not one bad pick. It's a pattern. The loyalty resume. And the first place you see how dangerous that can be is public health. Because this is where underqualification, it stops being abstract. If the government gets public health wrong, people don't just roll their eyes. People get sick and they lose trust and they ignore good guidance. That may be perhaps the biggest problem. They fall into bad information dressed up as, we're just asking questions. And that is why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is such a clean example of this problem that I'm talking about. Trump, of course, made RFK Jr. Secretary of Health and Human Services, and that is not a small job. I think perhaps before this administration, the HHS secretary role sort of escaped our notice in a lot of instances. It was certainly never as front and center as it has been since January of 2025. But HHS oversees huge parts of American life. Medicare, Medicaid, the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, public health messaging, disease response, safety for food, new drug approvals, of course, vaccine policy, and, just overall health programs that millions of us rely on. Now, to be fair, an HHS secretary doesn't have to be a doctor. That is not the standard. Some HHS secretaries have not been physicians. However, the person running HHS should have at least a serious relationship to public health, health policy, medical systems, science, insurance programs, hospital administration, or large-scale public health management in some way, shape, or form. And RFK Jr. did not come into the job with anything that resembled that kind of background. He was an environmental lawyer and an activist who spent years as one of the country's most prominent vaccine skeptics. And I don't know how anyone could think that is an unimportant facet. Because public health depends on trust. It depends on people believing that when health officials speak, they are relying on things like evidence and not trying to satisfy a movement or punish experts or launder old conspiracy thinking, because now they can do it with government letterhead. And once Kennedy got into the job, those concerns didn't disappear. One of the clearest examples was his decision to remove all 17 members of the CDC's Vaccine Advisory Committee. Now, the administration framed that as restoring trust. But when someone with JFK Jr.'s vaccine history or anti-vaccine history removes the entire vaccine advisory panel, it's not crazy to be asking whether this is reform or just ideological replacement. And, that's the point. The problem is not that RFK Jr. asks questions. The problem is that he was handed the public health steering wheel after years that he spent trying to slash the tires. And then you get this whole Surgeon General carousel that we've been witnessing, which sort of makes the same point just in miniature. The Surgeon General is often referred to as America's doctor. The job is not ceremonial. The Surgeon General is supposed to be a trusted public health communicator, a person who can translate medical evidence into guidance that people can understand and then trust. But, Trump's choices started to look less like a serious public health search and more like a casting call. First came Dr. Jeanette Nashaiwat, a Fox News medical contributor and physician. So again, precision matters. She is a doctor. This is, not a person with no medical background, but her nomination was withdrawn after questions were raised about her academic credentials. And, for a role that depends heavily on public trust, I don't think that that's a small issue. America's doctor should not arrive already, surrounded by, resume questions. Then came Dr. Casey Means. Means had an impressive educational credential, Stanford Medical School. The only problem was she hadn't completed residency. She didn't have an active medical license and was known mostly as a wellness figure aligned with RFK Jr.'s Maha world outlook. That doesn't mean that she has nothing useful to say about nutrition or chronic disease or metabolic health or whatever, but Surgeon General is not a wellness influencer. It's, it's not a Substack account. It's not a prize for saying the right things to the right political movement. At a moment where RFK Jr. was already, running HHS, choosing someone without an active medical license as Surgeon General, it raised an obvious question. Is this about maintaining trust in public health or restoring trust in public health, or just installing a, Maha representative? Then Means was withdrawn too. Trump moved to Dr. Nicole Safir, a radiologist and Fox News medical contributor. Safir is more conventionally credentialed than Means, certainly, but, so the argument should not be that she is unqualified. In the same way, the argument is that the whole process sort of revealed a filter. Fox doctor, Maha wellness figure, Fox doctor again. It looked like public health was being routed through, this television familiarity and movement approval. And that is the loyalty resume in healthcare. It not always zero credentials. Sometimes it's partial credentials. Sometimes it's mismatched credentials. Sometimes it's real medical background just pulled through a deeply political media machine. The danger is the filter, because public health can't function as content. Vaccine guidance, isn't supposed to feel like, factional warfare. Disease response is not about branding. The Surgeon General cannot look like a casting decision. And HHS cannot be run by someone whose main qualification in Trump's eyes seems to be that he validates the movement's distrust of every institution. It's, particularly the ones he now controls. When that happens, the public doesn't get better health leadership by any definition. It gets confusion with a government seal. And that's the larger pattern. The question isn't who can best protect public health. The question is who speaks the language of Trumpism. And that's how the loyalty resume works. And if you can distort public health, you can distort anything. Which brings us to education and defense, two agencies where Trump's choices show how the same pattern can hit very different institutions in very different ways. One deals with schools, students, civil rights, special education, student aid, so on. The other deals with, troops and weapons and alliances and classified operations and war. So, yeah, they're very, very different missions, but the same staffing disease seems to have infected both of them. So let's start with Linda McMahon. Trump made Linda McMahon the Secretary of Education. And, as everyone knows, I think this is the former head of World Wrestling Entertainment. Which makes, the cheap joke almost too easy. But the cheap joke is not the strongest argument. Linda McMahon has run a large business. She led the Small Business Administration in Trump's first term. She has executive experience. We're not going to deny that. So the argument is not that she has never managed anything. The argument is that the Department of Education is not the Small Business Administration. It's certainly not the WWE. Education is its own universe. The Department of Education deals with federal education policy and civil rights enforcement in schools, support for students with disabilities, low-income students, student loans, oversight of higher education, and programs that affect millions of families. If you're going to run that department, you should have deep experience with education, teaching, school administration, something in higher education or education policy, special ed, student aid, something directly connected to the mission. And McMahon did not come with that kind of background. And the sharper concern, is not just that she lacked traditional educational experience. The sharper concern is that Trump's movement has spent years attacking the Department of Education itself. See, when you appoint someone with extremely limited education background to run an agency your movement has talked about shrinking or gutting or dismantling, that's not just a resume mismatch. You've put forth your mission statement by your hiring. It's like hiring someone to run the library because they have strong feelings about closing libraries. And this matters because the Department of Education is not a vague Washington blob. It is there to protect students whose local systems may fail them. Again, students with disabilities and poor students and students facing discrimination, students buried under loans, families who need someone above the local school board who will step in and say, no, actually federal civil rights law still applies here, in Podunk School District. So when you decide that ideology, it takes preference over expertise at education, the people who get hurt aren't bureaucrats. They're kids and families and schools that are already running on fumes. And, that is one more version of the loyalty resume. Now look at Pete Hegseth at defense. And again, precision matters. Pete Hegseth served in the military. And, we give credit for that. It's relevant. Nobody should pretend otherwise. However, military service and television commentary are not the same thing as running the Department of Defense. The Pentagon is one of the largest and most complex institutions on the face of the earth. It deals with global military operations, procurement, alliances, nuclear policy, classified information, troop readiness, intelligence coordination, crisis response, and countless decisions that put American service members directly in harm's way. That job, the qualification for that job, it needs to be more than confidence. It requires large-scale management experience, to say the least. Discipline, judgment, restraint, respect for process, respect for classified information, a clear understanding that the Pentagon is not cable news. None of these things could be used to describe Pete Hegseth. Hegseth's public identity was built heavily around, television and culture war politics and, let's face it, performative toughness. And on a panel show, that plays great. It's not the same as running a global defense bureaucracy. There is a difference between having opinions about the Pentagon on television and being responsible for the Pentagon when that secure phone rings. And the concerns about judgment were not abstract. The signal controversy became a perfect example of why seriousness matters. When sensitive military or national security discussions end up, on the wrong communications channels, that is not just a boner or a technical mistake. This is a question of judgment and discipline. That is whether the person at the top understands the full weight of the job they've taken on. And, there's also the serious history of alcohol use where Hegseth is concerned. And I'm not going to speak on that with any sense of authority because I don't know the man. All I know is what has been reported, as I'm sure most of you do too. But it's another facet of the Pete Hegseth story that just doesn't seem to mesh with the job that he's been placed in. So McMahon and Hegseth show two very different versions of the same pattern. In one case, it's an agency treated like, an ideological enemy. In the other, and it's an agency treated like a stage for bravado and toughness and culture war performance. But underneath both of them is the same question. Was this person chosen because they were the strongest possible steward of that particular institution, or just because Trump liked them, because they fit his political project? That's the loyalty resume. It doesn't always say this person has no experience. Sometimes it says this person has the wrong experience, but the right politics. And that is how a government starts to fail. Not all at once, not with a single dramatic announcement, but appointment by appointment, or should I say, bad appointment by bad appointment, agency by agency, until the people in charge are not the ones most prepared to protect the mission. They are the ones most prepared to serve the ego. And if that is dangerous in education and defense, I would say it becomes even more dangerous when we start to talk about things like intelligence and federal law enforcement. Because then we're not just talking about policy, we're talking about surveillance, investigations, classified information, the machinery of the state. And, underqualification here does not carry the same risk as some of the other jobs. You put the wrong person in a ceremonial role, maybe you get some embarrassing speeches and weirdness on camera. You put the wrong person in health and people can lose trust in medical guidance. Put the wrong person in education and kids and families suffer. But you put the wrong person in intelligence or federal law enforcement and you're handing them, again, the machinery of the state. Surveillance, investigations, classified information, counterintelligence, criminal referrals. the power to make someone's life very small very quickly. And that is why loyalty-based staffing is especially, egregious here. I suppose we can start with Bill Pulte. Pulte ran the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and that's a real job. Housing finance matters. The FHFA oversees major parts of the mortgage system, including Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But then, for reasons passing understanding, Trump moved Pulte into the role of acting director of national intelligence. And, if I was going to put a sound effect in here, it would be the record scratch. The director of national intelligence oversees the intelligence community. That means agencies and offices dealing with foreign threats and classified intelligence and surveillance authorities, counterterrorism, cyber threats, intelligence analysis, information that shapes national security decisions at the highest levels of government. It's not like a side quest. This shouldn't have been, well, he did housing pretty good, let's try espionage. Pulte had no obvious intelligence background. None. No long record of national security leadership, no deep experience managing classified information or intelligence analysis. His public usefulness to Trump, has to come from something else. He had shown a willingness to use his housing finance role to pursue claims involving Trump's perceived political enemies. I just talked about this in a recent episode. And, how is that not a concern? If what makes you attractive to Trump is your willingness to aim government power at his enemies, what does it mean when you're now giving that person a role connected to national intelligence? The question stops being who is best equipped to protect national security and becomes who has already shown that they know where Trump wants the spotlight pointed. Apparently, if you can regulate mortgages, you are the perfect choice for the CIA. By that logic, my barber should be cleared to land planes. But, yes, it's absurd, but absurd doesn't mean harmless. Sometimes absurd is how dangerous things enter the room. They arrive wearing a clown nose, and by the time everyone is done laughing, it's too late. And that brings me, of course, to Kash Patel. Patel is another example of where precision matters. He is not necessarily a random guy pulled out of a comment section and handed the FBI. He has a legal background. He worked in national security adjacent roles. He has government experience. So the argument where Patel is concerned is not that he's never been near Washington. The argument is that the FBI director is not supposed to be the president's, muscle guy. He's not supposed to be the president's vengeance concierge. The FBI is supposed to have independence from the White House and political pressure in general. Not perfection. The FBI has a long and complicated history. That includes some very ugly abuses. No serious person would pretend that that's not true. However, the principle is supposed to be clear. Federal law enforcement does not belong personally to the president. It's not there to punish critics. It's not there to settle scores. It's not there to turn a political leader's enemies into, its investigative calendar. The FBI director needs independence, restraint, judgment, and serious law enforcement leadership experience. Critics argued Patel lacked senior law enforcement leadership experience. They also warned that his public posture towards the FBI in the media and Trump's enemies made him dangerous, to say the least, for a role that requires, or is supposed to require, independence. That's the real issue. Can the FBI director say no to the president? Can he protect the Bureau from political misuse? Can he separate the law from Trump's bruised, ego missions? If the answer is no, then the Bureau becomes something else entirely. It's not law enforcement anymore. It's just the Office of Retaliation. That is why this line matters. The FBI is not supposed to be led by someone auditioning to be, the president's, go-to guy. And then, this was short-lived, but that we had Dan Bongino as the deputy director of the FBI. And again, he had law enforcement related experience. He worked for the NYPD and served in the Secret Service. But in recent years, he was best known as a fiercely partisan media figure and pro-Trump commentator. And law enforcement adjacent experience isn't the same as FBI executive leadership. The FBI is not just another police department. It handles counterterrorism and counterintelligence and cybercrime and public corruption and civil rights crimes and organized crime and white-collar crime and national security investigations. The deputy director is not there to provide vibes. That person helps run the Bureau. So when you had, when he put Patel and Bongino together, the concern was bigger than either of their resumes. It looked like federal law enforcement was being reshaped through people whose public identities were tied to nothing more so than grievance politics. And, of course that matters because the security state can be captured without changing the name on the building. You don't have to abolish institutions to corrupt them. You can hollow them out. You can replace independent people with obedient people, and you can make career staff, the most qualified in most cases, genuinely afraid. You can teach everyone that experience is suspicious and restraint is weakness and loyalty is the thing you need for survival. You can keep the same seal on the podium, but you can really substantively change what the agency is doing. That is institutional rot. And in the security state, rot has teeth. It decides what gets investigated and what gets ignored. I mean, we've seen a lot of examples of these things being tested. It decides who is treated like a threat and who is treated like a friend of the boss. It decides whether law enforcement acts as a referee or as a partisan gang. That is why this part of the story matters so much. When loyalty replaces expertise in health or education, people can be harmed. But when loyalty replaces expertise in intelligence and law enforcement, things start pointing at political enemies, and that is an entirely different kind of danger. And this brings us to one more version of the same problem. This one is the billionaire version. Because if Trump's personal philosophy says loyalty can replace expertise, it also says that wealth can replace public accountability. And this means that we have to talk about Elon Musk and DOGE. Now, I realize that Elon Musk is now no longer a part of the story. But either way, his role was important, and I think it fits into this category extremely well, and it requires a slightly different argument, to be honest, because the lazy person's argument is Elon Musk is unqualified, and while technically I guess that is a valid argument, it's not quite right. Musk has experience running companies. He has managed major private enterprises. He's worked in technology, manufacturing, rockets, cars, satellite, software, and, whatever the hell category X belongs in now. But the argument is not that Elon Musk has never managed anything. And we can have arguments all day long about, we can debate how much influence he has in the companies that he quote unquote runs, and how much of it is the people that, he has under him and the minds that are at work for him. But either way, I mean, he's not without experience. The real argument is that running companies does not qualify you to restructure the entire federal government. Those are very, very different things. A company is not a government. A CEO, particularly in this case, is not an elected official. And maybe most importantly, citizens are not customers. Terms of services are not constitutional rights. And public programs they're not supposed to be looked at just as inefficiencies waiting to be deleted by, the rich guy with the spreadsheet and a chainsaw. And I wish that chainsaw was just a metaphor, but we know he actually had one at one point. But either way, this was the problem with DOGE. It treated government like a broken company that needed a genius outsider to barge in and slash costs and fire people and grab access and break systems, and then, declare victory before anyone actually could check whether the numbers had any validity to them whatsoever. Government cannot work that way, and it should not work that way, because the federal government handles things that private companies do not get to treat casually. Social Security records, Medicare systems, veterans benefits, disaster response, tax information, student aid, civil service protections, various kinds of sensitive data, public rights, programs that people depend on because the alternative is real harm, not just, a bad quarterly report. The private sector slogan is move fast and break things. But, when you're talking about government, the question has to be, what happens to the people living inside the things that you break? That's not red tape for the sake of red tape. That is democracy trying not to become, a demolition derby. And Musk's role raised obvious problems right from the get-go. First and foremost, he was not elected. And he was not confirmed by the Senate as like a cabinet secretary. His authority was at best murky. His accountability was limited, if it existed at all. And his companies had massive interests involving the federal government. Tesla, SpaceX, contracts and regulators and subsidies, agencies making decisions that could affect his business. And that is not an ethics footnote. That is perhaps the biggest ever example of conflict of interest. If someone's companies depend on federal contracts and federal regulators, then giving that person broad influence inside the federal government and calling it efficiency is a bald-faced lie. It's a conflict of interest, of the highest order. And this is where Musk fits the larger pattern. He represents Trump's favorite myth. The genius outsider who can fix institutions by disrespecting them hard enough. And, it's not the first time we've heard the pitch. Government is broken, so bring in a businessman. Government is slow, so bring in someone who fires people. Government is complicated, so we have to have someone who doesn't give a damn about the complications. But, sometimes complications are there for a reason. Sometimes complications are the job. Sometimes the process exists because people have rights, and The rules are there because the last guy abused the power. Sometimes the paperwork is what keeps your benefit or your record or your privacy or your job from being treated just like clutter. And of course, government can be inefficient. I mean, good grief. No one argues against that concept. Anyone who has ever dealt with the federal website knows parts of government feel like they were, just intentionally made to be complicated. But inefficiency is not solved by giving a billionaire vague authority, massive access, despite major conflicts, and a political permission slip to just start smashing things and then explain them later. If that's being packaged as reform, it's a lie. It's just a tech demo for the oligarchy. And notice the pattern again. RFK at HHS says, distrust the public health establishment. Linda McMahon at Education says, put someone in charge who will weaken the agency. Pete Hegseth at Defense says, television bravado can substitute large-scale institutional leadership. Bill Pulte at Intelligence says, loyalty and usefulness can, trump everything else, pardon the pun. And then, Patel at the FBI says grievance politics should be installed near the machinery of federal law enforcement. So Musk at DOGE and the whole billionaire disruption can be treated as public administration shouldn't really have been much of a surprise. They're all different jobs, different people, but it's the same disease, the loyalty resume. And in Musk's case, the resume had a bonus attachment, enormous wealth. Because, in Trump's world, wealth is treated as proof of universal competence. You made money, therefore you understand everything. You launched rockets, therefore you should be in charge of streamlining Medicaid. You gave the world the Cybertruck, therefore you understand constitutional limits. I mean, it's anything, but it ain't logic. It's just, billionaire astrology. Democracy is not a company, and the public is not a workforce. The federal government, it should not be a sandbox for rich men who want to test austerity on actual human beings. So no, you do not fix government by letting a billionaire rummage through it like a junk drawer with classified documents. You fix government with expertise, accountability, transparency, and people who understand that public service means serving the public, not the president, not the movement, not the brand, the public. So, okay, just take a step back from the individual names. RFK is different than McMahon. McMahon is different than Hegseth. Hegseth is different from Pulte. Pulte from Patel. Patel from Elon Musk. Some of these people have some real credentials. Some have partial qualifications. Some have experience just, in the wrong field. Some have management backgrounds, but not for the institution they were handed. Some are famous, some are ideological, some are wealthy, some are loyal, some are wrecking balls with business cards. But together, I believe they tell the same story. In Trump's second administration, expertise is treated as suspicious. Institutions are treated as enemies. Television presence is treated as leadership. Wealth is wisdom. Loyalty equals competence. And personal devotion to one man is treated as public service. That's the loyalty resume. And the danger is not that one unqualified person gets one important job. The danger is institutional rot. Qualified people leave. We've seen it in all of these departments. Career staff get sidelined. Experts stop being heard. Agency memory is lost by happenstance or erased intentionally. Rules are seen as obstacles. Facts become negotiable. Law enforcement becomes personal. Science is questioned at best, factional at worst. National security becomes another stage for political theater, and the public is left with a government less able to do the basic job of governing. Now, it's possible to survive a bad hire, here and there. Every administration has them. But when bad hiring is your philosophy, when the wrong credentials become the actual important credentials, when the question is no longer, can this person serve the public, but will this person serve the president? Then, something much bigger is happening. And you are not staffing a government anymore. You're just building a court. And in a republic, that should scare the hell out of anyone, because government is not supposed to be a loyalty program. It's not supposed to come with gold tier access for people who flatter the boss. It's not supposed to reward the loudest performer or the richest outsider or the most obedient partisan or the person most willing to turn an agency into a weapon. Government is supposed to serve the governed, not the ego of the man temporarily in the Oval Office, not the grievance machine around him, not the movement that treats expertise like treason. The country is supposed to be served. That's supposed to be the standard. And if that standard sounds, outdated or old-fashioned, good. Maybe we could use a little old-fashioned at this point. Maybe we could use the radical idea that the person running a public health agency should respect public health. That person who's running the education system should understand education, or the person that's running defense should have the judgment to handle defense. That the person running the FBI should be independent enough to say no sometimes. That the person touching federal systems should be accountable to the public, not just be rich enough to be interesting. Because loyalty is not a qualification. Obedience is not expertise, and celebrity is not competence. Government is not a prize booth for people who passed the Trump loyalty test. That is the entire problem. The loyalty resume may get you hired in Trump's Washington, but it does not make the country safer. It does not make the government smarter. It doesn't make public service better. It just makes the institutions weaker, louder, and more obedient. And that is exactly what this administration wants to do. Not a government full of people who know how to do the job, but a government full of people who know who they work for. And that is the part we should never get used to. All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to download today's episode. I appreciate it more than I can say, and I would love to hear from you, whether it's on the subject of this episode or whatever you would like to say, whether it's critique or compliment or suggestion or question or whatever. If you go to the website, neighborontheleft.com, go to the contact section, you can use DMs on any of the social media platforms, or you can use the email address and reach out and let me know your thoughts. While you're there, check out the episodes section where you can download or stream any of the episodes of this podcast, going all the way back to the first one. And I also encourage everyone to check out the blog section, because when I post to the blog section for each of these episodes, I include all of my sources. And I would like to think we can all agree that sources are important. So the weekend is here. I'll be back on Monday with another full episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. Between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of weekend you'd wish for others.